Despite being in the middle of a global trade route and home to millions of people across several different countries, the mountains and jungles of Central America remain one of the most difficult places in the world to navigate. And today, while modern roads, railways, and canals make it much easier to get from one coast to the next, it still remains very difficult to travel across the mountains and jungles of the countryside, especially for the many migrants who are making the journey from South America. This is due to the difficulty of the terrain, as well as the fact that there are no roads connecting Central and South America, meaning that unless a person can afford to take a boat or a plane, they would have to travel across a remote area known as the Darien Gap by foot, with the Darien Gap being an extremely dangerous place covered by steep mountains and dense forests, where heavy rainfalls regularly lead to landslides and flash floods. In addition to the dangers of the land, there are more human threats in the forms of violent rebels and criminal organizations, smuggling both illegal goods and people from Colombia to Panama, with there being many reports of migrants dying in the gap as a result of tropical diseases, lack of food, lack of clean drinking water, or simply making the wrong turn and becoming lost in the jungles forever. Now, many of these environmental threats have been constant concerns for the local people for several centuries. This would include the many indigenous communities, as well as the later Spanish conquistadors, who first attempted to cross these mountains and remote jungles during the 1500s. But eventually by the 1800s, people had begun looking for a way to more easily travel across Central America. But unlike today, instead of looking for a path to go from south to north, they were mainly looking to get from east to west. This is because despite global trade and travel becoming more common, if you were traveling by boat, it would have still taken you several months to get from the Pacific to the Atlantic Oceans. This because since there are no easy routes through Central America, ships had to sail around the whole of South America. Therefore, in order to reduce travel time, a new path was cut through the land with the creation of the Panama Canal, with construction beginning in the 1880s with the French. But after a series of issues, including the loss of around 20,000 workers, largely due to tropical diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, the project was largely completed by the United States in 1914, and when the canal finally opened, it now allowed ships to travel between the Pacific and the Atlantic via the Caribbean in only a few weeks instead of several months. However, before the Panama Canal was open, there were several other proposals and projects in neighboring countries that tried to capitalize on the increasing need to get people and goods from one coast to the other. For example, American shipping tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt established a network of steamships that would go from New York to Nicaragua, and from Nicaragua to San Francisco, with many travelers taking this route through Central America during the 1850s, in order to get to the gold rush in California. But these trips were still unpredictable and would constantly face dangers and delays, such as the steamships exploding and killing the passengers on board. As a result of this, an American archaeologist, journalist, and diplomat named Ephraim George Squier hoped to finally be the one to establish a safe route across Central America by building a railway from one coast of Honduras to the other. Now, Squier initially traveled to Honduras in the early 1850s and heard that people were attempting to build a canal across the neighboring country of Nicaragua, but after those plans fell apart, and possibly hearing about the construction of a railroad across Panama, which is then still a part of Colombia, Squier hoped to build a new railroad across Honduras instead. And after fundraising in the United States, Squier was eventually able to raise money for the cause in New York City, and even gained the support of several prominent politicians, such as Robert Walker, the former US Secretary of the Treasury, and Senator Robert Stockton, a veteran of the Mexican-American War who had helped capture California. And as the US continued to expand out west, Squier believed that Honduras and the rest of Central America would eventually fall under American protection, which would lead to an increase in European immigration and trade in the area. Therefore, he planned for the Honduras Railway to be the first of many schemes to buy up as much land in the country as he could, so he could then sell it for a later profit, with Squier even having hopes of eventually owning several local mines in order to control the shipment of valuable jewels and metals. Now, in order to get approval for this railway, Squier gathered a team of engineers and traveled to Honduras disguised as a scientific expedition. This was done to avoid any suspicion from the rival construction companies in nearby Panama and Nicaragua. And during this time, Honduras was led by Liberal President Jose Cabanas, who was open to working with Squier, with Cabanas and his allies seeing the railway project as a way to strengthen the country by bringing in more economic activity, new immigrants, as well as weapons for the National Army. But just as negotiations were about to start, Cabanas' attention quickly turned to other things, as Rafael Carrera, the conservative president of Guatemala, began an invasion of the country in 1853, leading to the outbreak of war. Now, earlier in the 1820s and 30s, most of Central America had been united as one federal republic. But after a series of conflicts between the local liberal and conservative factions, the republic ended up breaking down, leading to the creation of the independent states of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, with some of the remaining territory being claimed by Mexico as well as Britain. And by the 1850s, much of Central America was still divided between these liberal and conservative factions, with the liberals generally supporting a secular education system, weakening the influence of the Catholic Church, and forming alliances with more representative democracies like the United States, with their base of support largely being made up of academics, merchants, and the upwardly mobile middle classes. While the conservatives generally supported a Catholic education, protecting the influence of the church, and forming alliances with European monarchies, with their base of support largely being the clergy, the old Spanish colonial elite, as well as large landowners. Now, while Cabanas was away, Squier was able to negotiate with the remaining government officials, who agreed that the railroad project could use the local timber from the forest and stone from the land to build the tracks, with the government also providing them with 1,000 square miles of land, with there being an understanding that the company could buy additional land around the railroad for a reduced price of 12.5 cents an acre. In exchange for this, the company would build the railroad within 8 years, and once finished, they would pay the Honduran government $1 for every grown-up who rode the train, with both sides agreeing to these terms in June of 1853. Now, while Cabanas approved of this deal, as he was fighting a war during this time, he began pressuring the company to help him obtain weapons and ammo for the Honduran army. As a result of this, over the course of the next year in 1854, Squier returned to New York in order to help raise money for Cabanas, with the railroad company eventually taking out two $20,000 loans on behalf of the Honduran government in order for them to buy, package, and ship several cannons, guns, and ammo back to Central America to help defend them against an invading Guatemalan army and to ensure Cabanas' continued support for the railroad project. However, when the news got out that Honduras was building a new railroad and that several Americans were helping them to ship weapons into the country, the invading conservative government of Guatemala grew concerned that this new railway might weaken their economy by diverting trade through Honduras, and that these Americans might also be planning on launching a larger invasion of Central America. This because, along with the liberals and the conservatives, a third major player in Latin America during this time were the filibusters. These were foreign mercenaries, who in addition to leading their own campaigns, would often be hired by local political factions to help fight their rivals, with the most famous filibuster during this time being the American William Walker, who had just invaded Mexico in 1853 and declared himself to be the president of Baja California and later the president of Sonora, with several of these filibusters hoping to annex territory in Latin America in order to create new slave states for the American South. But after this plan failed, Walker would end up fleeing back to the United States, and despite being put on trial in San Francisco, his popularity with the general public led a sympathetic jury to acquit him of any wrongdoing. And despite concerns from Guatemala that another similar invasion may occur, no filibusters ended up being sent to Honduras during this time. Now, things started to go downhill for the railroad company, when several Honduran politicians as well as Squier fell ill, with one politician, named Jose Francisco Barrundia, passing away as a result of his illness. This was a great loss for the company, as Barrundia was a supporter of Squier's railway project, and had even traveled to the United States to help raise further support for the Honduran government, but he had died before talks between the two countries could begin. Soon afterwards, in 1855, news arrived that Panama had completed their first coast-to-coast railway, and that Vanderbilt had also begun expanding his steamboat business in Nicaragua. And now that there were two established routes through Central America, it led many Americans to lose interest in building another railway in Honduras. Not wanting to give up on the project, after recovering from his illness, Squier traveled to Europe in an attempt to gain some financial support from either the French or the English. However, by the end of 1855, things had gotten even worse, as the liberal Cabanas had fallen from power and was eventually replaced by a conservative president, Jose Gardolia, who openly opposed Squier and the railway project. And even though there was some interest from the British, concerns about the stability of the region were raised, especially after William Walker returned with an army to invade the neighboring country of Nicaragua. Now, in 1854, a civil war had broken out in the country between the liberals and the conservatives, with Walker having been hired to fight on the liberal side. However, soon after arriving, several of the liberal leaders of Nicaragua were either killed in battle or died as a result of tropical diseases. This left Walker, an American mercenary, as the most powerful leader of the liberal cause, with Walker going out to defeat the conservatives and install a puppet government under his control. Now, Walker believed that in order to properly rule the country, he had to control the flow of American mercenaries and weapons into Nicaragua. Therefore, he hoped to establish an alliance with Cornelius Vanderbilt's local steamboat company in order to help bring more people and supplies to Central America. However, the company resisted. This because by 1855, they controlled one of the most lucrative transportation routes on the continent and did not want to risk their success by associating with Walker, who they viewed as being reckless. In fact, before heading to Nicaragua, Walker had attempted to form an alliance with the company's West Coast agent, Kingsland Garrison, who had previously served as the mayor of San Francisco. However, Garrison refused to work with Walker, and even after Walker took over Nicaragua, Garrison went out of his way to fire company officials who had helped Walker or who had given him money. But things quickly changed after Garrison met a lawyer named Edmund Randolph, with an alliance quickly forming between Garrison, Randolph, and a shipping magnate named Charles Morgan, with Randolph, who was a close friend of Walker's, having convinced Garrison and Morgan that if they paid him well, he could help them take control of Vanderbilt's steamboats in Nicaragua, with their plan being to send Randolph to Nicaragua to negotiate with Walker. After reconnecting as friends, Randolph and Walker eventually came to an elaborate agreement, where Walker's government would take control of the company's boats, and then give Randolph a charter with the right to operate the boats in Nicaragua. Randolph would then sell this contract to Garrison and Morgan for a profit, with Garrison and Morgan then making an agreement with Walker that in exchange for the steamboats, they'll allow him to use them to ship in American weapons and filibusters for free. And when this plan worked out, Garrison and Morgan controlled one of the most important trade routes on the continent. Randolph had made a significant amount of money, and Walker was able to increase his base of support by bringing in hundreds of new American filibusters. However, Vanderbilt was furious that he had lost control of the company, and soon formed an alliance with the rival Costa Rican government, where he agreed to pay them $40,000 worth of gold, in exchange for helping him get his steamboats back, with Vanderbilt making the argument that if they cut off Walker's steamboat supply lines, it would help bring down his puppet government. Now, while these plans were being made, Walker had made several enemies, leading him to declare himself the new president of Nicaragua, and legalizing slavery in the country. This led a military alliance to form between Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Costa Rica to remove him from power. And when these countries attacked Nicaragua, Vanderbilt's agents were able to use this opportunity to regain control of his steamboats, further weakening Walker's hold on power, with Walker eventually surrendering to the American Navy in 1857 and being allowed to return to the United States. Now back in Britain, Squier was still attempting to raise funds for a railroad across Honduras, with Squier even hiring a new team of engineers and sending them to Central America. Led by John C. Troutwine, the team spent much of 1858 surveying the countryside and calculating the cost of building a railway across the jungles, mountains, and rivers of Honduras. Now, when Squier pitched this idea to investors, he claimed that doing a survey would cost less than $60,000, the railway would be 160 miles long, no major tunnels or bridges were needed, and that the final project would cost only $6 million. However, when Troutwine returned, almost $200,000 had already been spent on surveying, with Troutwine concluding that they would need to build at least 230 miles of rail, multiple tunnels, multiple bridges, and that the final project would cost about $14.3 million. With this report collapsing the last remaining support for the railroad project in Europe, leading a dejected Squier to return to New York in 1859, and when Squier eventually returned to journalism and abandoned the Honduras project after almost a decade of work, not even 1 foot of rail had been constructed. Now back in Central America, Walker had returned, hoping to lead another military expedition, but he was soon captured by the British and would eventually be executed by the Honduran government in 1860. Now during the 1860s, although travel through Central America declined as a result of the outbreak of the Civil War in the United States, thousands still made the trek through those jungles in the hopes of reaching the gold and silver mountains of California and Nevada. But by 1869, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, many Americans decided to use this new railway instead, with travelers now being able to get from New York City to San Francisco in less than 10 days. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks so much to my patrons, Untroid, NMS, and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.